You might be wondering why we're talking about geology in the middle of a biology session. But it's very, very important because the deep time idea that came about from the early geologists is really the problem. And that's one of the things Darwin used when he developed his theory of evolution. He needed deep time. So we'll see how that kind of fits right in here. But this is Sycamore Point over in Scotland, if you're wondering, where this really kind of began. So as I was mentioning a little bit, there's two pillars really of conventional science and deep science. Evolutionary science, whatever you want to call it. There's the pillar of evolution, where you have to have, ancestry and descent from a simple form of life, which has been debunked from that last talk. And then you also have to have deep time. You can't have one without the other. You have to hide this evolutionary story behind, well, it could happen over millions of years. It could happen over billions of years. And so they need deep time. So that was very, very important. But where did deep time come from? Deep time originated in the more recent time, anyway, with a book by Malay, who actually turned his name backwards, and it was published after he died because he was afraid of the ruckus it would cause. But he claimed in his book that the Earth is about 2 billion years old. And then came along James Hutton, who's often known as the father of deep time. And that's where he saw that Sycamore Point. And he realized there's rocks laying kind of flat on top and rocks tilted down below, because there must have been immense amounts of time in between. That's why he talked about the immense amount of time. He started talking about millions of years. And then he said there's no deluge needed. So he was trying to steer us away from the biblical story of the flood and say we can explain everything, except what he called uniformitarianism, where everything's uniform. Everything we see happening today, slow processes today, slow erosion, slow rivers, all these processes can explain everything we see on Earth. And he said that must have taken an immense amount of time. And then Charles Lyell came along a little bit later in time, and he wrote a couple of books that explained uniformitarianism. He actually used that word, that everything's uniform, these processes are uniform. And that's what's really entrenched in geology today. This concept of deep time is very, very important, because they don't believe there's a global flood. They don't believe there ever was a global flood. But yet you just look down, you see thousands of feet of rock below your feet in most places in the world, filled with fossils that could only have occurred during the flood. But Lyell's book was very, very important because he was used by Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin took his books along on the HMS Beagle. And Darwin wrote this later. He said, I always feel as if my books came half out of Lyell's brains. So without that deep time, there wouldn't be no evolutionary theory. He says, for I've always thought that the great merit of the Principles of Geology, which is the book Lyell wrote, was that it altered the whole tone of one's mind. So without this concept of deep time, that pillar of deep time, you lose that theory of evolution. You don't have time for evolution to occur. You can't hide behind the shroud in this fantasy world of if given enough time, anything can happen. And as you saw in the previous talk, it's too complex for it just to happen. But you need deep time. Ernest Tenke said this, an atheist, in 1906. He was already bragging, our science of evolution won its greatest triumph when at the beginning of the 20th century, its powerful opponents, the churches, became reconciled to it and endeavored to bring their dogmas into line with it. This is when you saw things like the gap theory coming out in the Schofield Study Bible. The idea is that you had to have deep time somehow fit into the Bible, because that's what scientists were arguing for. They tried to explain away by geology that you need deep time for all these geological features that we see. When in fact, that's not true at all. And unfortunately, I put sadly on here because it is rather sad. Sad that many influential leaders, even church leaders, deny the global flood and teach a local flood in an old Earth, because they feel they have to reconcile to science, what they believe is science. But science is really not very scientific. There is science that is, but a lot of conventional science is not very scientific. They're the ones that believe that we came from no life. They're the ones that believe that somehow inorganic minerals can somehow create life on its own. You just saw. So let's look at the rocks. What does the Great Flood explain? Does it explain all the rock layers that we see in the world? Or most of the rock layers we see in the world? I believe it does. The best explanation for these thousands and thousands and thousands of feet of rock we see all over the world, we drill oil from, get coal from, the best explanation is the flood, and you'll see this here in a minute. Do the rock layers really need deep time to be deposited? That's one of the questions I'm going to examine today. Is there evidence of deep time between the layers? And we're going to look at that as well. So we're going to look at a little bit little bit out of my flood talk, 3 truths of the flood or the Bible, because if the flood is true, then the Bible is true. And we believe they're both true. The first, that there was a global flood. Second, we'll look at it was a very catastrophic flood. It wasn't a very tranquil flood. It didn't slowly fill up your bathtub. It was a very violent flood. And we see that in the fossils. And thirdly, we'll look at it was a recent flood. There's a lot of evidence that this flood didn't happen even millions of years ago, if there was a flood. It happened just thousands of years ago, about 4,500 years ago, like the Bible tells us. And that's what the evidence supports. 2 Peter 3, God told Peter to write this. He said God knew there would be scoffers in the last days. He said, there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts. For this they willingly are ignorant. Willingly ignorant. That by the word of God the heavens are of old, the earth standing out of water in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. So he says they're not stupid. He says, but they're willingly ignorant. They willingly ignore the evidence. They willingly ignore the evidence of the flood right below their feet. I can see in Noah's day there was never a flood. People didn't believe there was going to be a flood because there was no evidence of it. Here we have all the evidence we need. That's what I get to examine. I'm going to show you some of that evidence today. All the evidence we need for the global flood is right there before our feet. You can go to the canyons all over the world, you can see it. Even conventional scientists accept 6 floods. This is the first flood of North America. That's North America supposedly back in the what's called the Cambrian. And the second flood, third flood, fourth flood, fifth flood, sixth flood. So they believe in 6 floods. They just don't believe there was a global flood. They don't believe it flooded everything. We'll see there is evidence that it did flood everything. This is their sea level curve. I hope it shows up here. This is where sea level, this is today's sea level here in the middle. And you can see they believe it goes up really high, and then it went down, went up really high, went down. And there's basically, and then it went up really high again here about the time the dinosaurs were buried in the flood. So they believe there's 2 big peaks. But in my research, we'll see there's really only one big peak. There's one progressive flood, and that's what the rocks really support. And I actually presented this at a conventional geology conference prior to COVID, and the audience was kind of like, huh. And I said, we've been lying to our students all these years about this high sea level down here. There really isn't any evidence of this, as we will see. The rocks don't support it. So this really what we see is one increase, higher, then higher, then higher, then higher yet, until we reach a peak, and then it went down. And that's what the Bible describes. This fits exactly with what the Bible describes. And you'll see the data that supports this here in just a minute. We used real rock data. I started studying this about 10 years ago. And it's been the greatest research I've ever done in my life, because it really is showing God's word is true. And I had the greatest job. I don't know why I get paid. Oh, my boss is back. Oh, I didn't mean to say that out loud. But I would do this for, but it's only because I am being paid enough that I can do this, that I have the time, because of supporters like you, that it gives me the time to do this. And so my job is to show you that God's word is true by showing there really was a global flood. And that's what I really enjoy doing. But we're really looking at observable data, and this is how science is supposed to be done. You're supposed to look at rocks and then make your interpretations. You're not supposed to just make things up. Unfortunately, many people already have their minds made up, and they go try to prove that, called verifiable science, verification science. They already think they already know the answer. That's really not how science should be done. You're supposed to follow the data. So I really did. I just started following the data. But I did assume that God's word is true. But I said, let's see what the rocks really show. So I've gathered over 3,000 geologic columns. That's if you were to drill a well right here down to the crust, how many thousands of feet you go through, how much sand, limestone, whatever the case is, all the way down, all over the world. I've done 5 continents now, and I'm working on the 6th continent, Australia. So you've got a pretty good data set here, pretty much the entire world that I've been looking at. We keep track of the rock types and those mega sequences, those chapters of the flood, whatever you want to call them. We kind of lump them into these big flood events. But the floods kept getting higher and higher, as we'll see. So the Bible tells us this. In the 600th year of Noah's life were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And I believe at this point, this is what initiated the tectonic plates of the world. So we didn't have any tectonic plates, really. I don't think the way God made the original earth, but he broke it all up miraculously, or whatever the case was. I don't know if he needed any sort of asteroid to hit the earth, some people suggest, but I think he just cracked open all these plates all over the earth. And then the plates started to move because of differences in density, things we don't need to get into. But keep in mind, Earth is the only planet in our solar system that has plates, these tectonic plates that actually moved. Other planets and some of the moons of the planets actually have cracks on them because they cooled and contracted, but they don't have plates that actually moved. And so Earth is the only planet that has these plates. And geologists, conventional geologists, don't know when the plates started to move. There's a big debate about that, but the Bible tells us pretty clear, a pretty good indication that the fountains of the deep burst all over the earth, cracks opened up all over the earth. We see magma that shot out of a lot of those cracks, and an unknown amount of water as well. So we don't know exactly how much water came out, but some water obviously, because it did rain upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights as well. So here's what was happening, and here's my sea level curve again. We'll look at these first three sequences, what was going on. We see basically it was a rise in sea level that was taking place. So you started this initial rise, and it's because you start to move plates. And we saw the effects of that plate movement still today. There's still plate movement this much per year. But that's not what was doing during the flood. John Baumgartner modeled that you would have runaway subduction under the right conditions of cooler, cold ocean crusts prior to the flood. And once you start to crack it open, immediately rocks start to subduct, and they go into the earth like they're still doing on the west coast of North America. If you're from California, Washington, those areas, particularly Northern California, it's still active. There's still potential there for a large earthquake, just like the one we saw in Turkey. Turkey's on one of these subduction zone boundary areas as well. And so that's why they had that unfortunately devastating earthquake a few days ago. But you can actually see this. You can still image into the earth. We can see that these slabs going down are still here. And they go way down here underneath North America all the way across. They've been doing this for quite some time. And notice they're still kind of the same color all the way down. And that color represents density. The density comes from the temperature of those slabs. Those slabs, and we've written many articles on this, those slabs are still cold. So they're down here way deep in the earth, all the way down to here's the core. They go way down deep in the earth, and they're still cold. How can they be cold if they've been moving this much per year over millions of years? These 60-mile thick slabs should have heated up. But this is kind of verification that John Baumgartner was right. There was runaway subduction, real rapid plate movement during that flood year. And we may come back to that a little bit later. Here's a few more examples. This is the one they show a lot from the Tonga plate over in the Pacific Ocean. You can see the same density. Here's all the earthquakes that happen. We can follow these all the way down. You can see everywhere they shoot these things across subduction zones in the Caribbean or wherever along the Andes, you see these cold slabs deep in the earth. Cold slabs deep in the earth, folks, that tells you those went down there fast. It's like sticking your hand in the oven with an oven mitt on. Leave it in there long enough, it's going to get hot. And you leave these slabs down there deep in the earth where the temperatures are a couple thousand degrees Celsius, 60 miles of rock is going to heat up pretty quick. And we're still seeing they're cold. So that tells us this happened recently, that the flood really wasn't that long ago, and the rocks did move down into the earth quickly. But when you start to move plates, of course, you get tsunamis, and this is a picture of one going over a seawall in Japan. But you get these tsunami waves that might have been 100, 200, 300 foot high during the flood year. Things that we'd never witnessed since, because today we're only moving plates this much per year. And there's sudden rapid movements. You move the ocean up and down, and that makes tsunamis. But during the flood year, there might have been hundreds and hundreds of these happening every day, pushing water back and forth. And so what we see is the first flooding that goes across the continents from those movements of the plates. We see the Salk mega sequences called, or chapter 1. We'll kind of go through these 6 chapters as we go along. But here, what you see, this is what's there today. This is the Salk mega sequence. So wherever it's blue or colored, that's where those rocks are. But you notice most of Africa's high and dry. Most of South America's high and dry. Canada, high and dry. Greenland. I didn't put the plates back together into the Pangea-like configuration. I thought it's best just to leave them where they are today. But this is where the Salk is there today. Notice a lot of Asia and Europe is still high and dry. Now, Australia's not done, so it isn't that Australia never floods in my model. It's just that it's not done. So everything else will get colored except for Australia. We're working on that. But notice a lot of the world didn't flood. You notice this is very common. We'll see the next sequence. It's almost the same. So don't blink, because this is the Salk. This is where the Cambrian explosion comes in. All of a sudden, at this level, there's life in fossils buried all over the world at the same time. And below it is that great unconformity, which is a big erosional surface which geologists still can't explain. It's all over the world at the same place, right below where the rocks first come in. So you had a lot of erosion, then you deposit this layer over parts of the earth. And this is the layer that contains all those different phyla. Almost every animal phyla pretty much is represented in that sudden Cambrian explosion. So the evolutionists try to say, well, that was 500 million years ago. There was, we don't know why everything happened so quickly, but suddenly life was all over the place. And they still can't explain it, but it's the initial layers of the flood that explains it best. So here's the next one. Did you guys blink? It looks almost the same. A little bit more in South America, but pretty much North Africa is all you get. You go to the next one. It's pretty much the same. So you see 3 layers stacked on top of each other, representing the first 3 sequences, Sauk, Tippecanoe, and Kaskaskia. All over the world, all pretty much do the same thing. You still see major areas of Africa high and dry. A lot of Asia, a lot of Europe, a lot of North America still high and dry. A lot of South America still high and dry. So you didn't flood everything right away, and that's why my sea level curve doesn't show major flooding. Like the conventional geologists try to show, they don't do this kind of stuff. We're the only ones in the world that are doing this research. No one else is looking at the global picture of the rocks across every continent. They might work on one continent here or there, one continent here or there, or if they are doing it, they're not publishing it. Maybe some of the oil companies are, but I work for an oil company, and we'll just, here's your little area, work your area. Don't go any beyond that area. So a lot of the oil and gas geologists, they really like this research because they get to see the global picture, which they don't get to do. But I didn't want to brag, but Dr. G wants me to tell you that we're the only ones doing this. And it's taken 10 years to get this far, so it's your support that allows this to get done. But what we find in those first 3 sequences, oddly enough, is we see almost all marine fossils. Sauk, Tippecanoe, Kaskaskia, the first 3 chapters, all the way up to about what's called the Pennsylvanian. All those rocks that we just saw are only flooding, I think, shallow seas. That's why it's the same area over and over and over, and the rest of the world stays high and dry because they're a little higher elevation. So let's move on to chapters 4 and 5, which I think might be days 40 to day 150 of the flood. And the Bible tells us this, and the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark. And according to my Hebrew experts here at ICR, it means it launched the ark. So waves hit it, and the ark just kind of didn't slowly start to float, it was launched. And the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth. The waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth. And all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. And it goes on to say by day 150 of the flood, a full 5 months or so into the flood before everything was covered. So it was not a very quick flood. It was 150 days to reach the highest point, the one over the top, and we're only partway there. So let's look at these days. These are the days where things got really bad. So if you're a human or an animal living on land, you probably weren't being affected as much except for the rain, and the flooding was mostly in areas that you didn't live anyway. They're just burying marine critters over and over and over on top of each other, more and more marine critters all over the world. But now the water starts to go higher and higher, like the Bible tells us, and we start to see a change in the fossils that are being buried. And the humans are probably starting to go, this isn't going away. Maybe I should listen to Noah. And remember, only 8 people believe there's going to be a flood. Noah, his wife, and Noah's 3 sons and their wives. Not even their relatives. Not even their mothers, if there's Noah's mother or anything. Nobody else came. They didn't believe there was going to be a flood. 8 people. 8 people walked through that door was salvation. If they walked through and God shut the door, their fates were sealed if you weren't on the ark. All the rest of the people on the earth, maybe 1 billion people, we don't know. 1 billion people might have died in the flood. Only 8 people survived. And the geneticists tell us that we all kind of come, as humans, we all come from 3 branches, 3 different discrete branches of DNA. And it comes back to the 3 sons of Noah. But Jesus is our salvation. He's opened that door of salvation again. Just like in the days of Noah, that salvation would have been to walk through that door of the ark. But only 8 people were found righteous. And all 2 of every kind, God brought those all to the ark. Yet Jesus, God himself, took on human form. The God who created everything. The God who was there for the judgment of the flood. The God who was there. Jesus was there the whole time. He came to earth, died, and opened up the door of salvation for all of us. Not just the Jewish people, but the Gentiles. Everybody in the world now has the opportunity for salvation. We just have to believe what Jesus did, who Jesus is, that he really is the Son of God. He is God, part of the Trinity. And salvation is there if we just believe. It's that simple. The obseric omega sequence comes next. Some people say Absaroka, but it's up to you. It depends where you're from. My years in Wyoming messed me up, so I'll blame it on that. But sea level continued to rise, as the Bible tells us, exceedingly higher, one higher yet. And now we're starting to flood the land. We're creating more ocean crust. So if you look at the ocean crust, this is a map of the age of the ocean crust. Of course, these are in millions of years if you look these up. But we believe these are all relative. The red stuff is the youngest, right along the ridges today, where it's moving this much per year. But during the flood year, it was moving this fast per second, according to John Baumgartner's research. And that's what those rocks deep in the Earth's mantle support, that there was rapid plate movement. So here's what we see. This is the younger rocks here in red. But the old stuff's green and blue. You see green and blue over here on the edges as you separated the continents of North America from Africa, etc. I moved around the Pacific Ocean. But this new ocean crust is very hot. When you make new ocean crust today, it's ridges. But the whole ocean floor pushed up because it was all new. So if you have a lot of hot stuff, hate to bring this up because it's politically and it's a big quantity about balloons. If you have a hot air balloon like the Chinese were launching, see, I knew it was coming. If you have a hot air balloon, it rises. Well, the ocean crust rises as well if it's hot. And that's why we see the ridges still today are even higher yet. The ridges are huge mountains, 10,000 foot high. They go through every ocean because that's where the ocean crust was formed during the flood. Now it's barely sputtering, so to speak, but it's still very hot. But the whole ocean pushes up. So if you're in your bathtub and suddenly the bottom of the bathtub goes up, what happens to the water? It starts going up too. Water doesn't compress well. And so water will go up and up and up. The more ocean crust you made, the more the waves went higher and higher and higher. And that's exactly, I believe, the mechanism that God used to bring on the flood was making a whole new ocean seafloor. And that really kicked into gear. If you go back, the oldest ocean crust we see goes back to the Absaroka megasequence. So there wasn't a whole lot of movement before this. There wasn't a whole lot of new ocean crust being made. That's why you're just flooding shallow seas. But now you're starting to flood the land because the water gets pushed up higher and higher. We'll start to see this, tsunami-like waves coming across the land. But you got to imagine tsunami waves bigger than we've ever witnessed. Waves that are probably 100, 200, 300 foot high coming in, taking away everything, taking away the vegetation. And that vegetation became coal seams. So we see the first appearance of extensive coal seams in the world all at the same time. It's called the Pennsylvanian system, or the Upper Carboniferous if you're in the rest of the world, because of all the coal that's deposited there. And we see the first animals in great numbers from the land start showing up. Before this, there was almost no land animals. And it's not a coincidence that the plants are being destroyed and buried, animals are being destroyed that lived on land and buried, mixed with marine animals, because the waves are coming in from the ocean. You always have mixing of land and marine. The Absaroka sequence, again, I think it's maybe day 40 to 90. I'm kind of guessing. But you see there's more coverage than we ever had before. Notice some of Africa starting to flood now. And a lot more of Europe are starting to flood. A little bit more of South America. So we go up to the next sequence, which I think where we reach the peak, called the Zuni. This is about the end of the Cretaceous, if you're more familiar with those terms. This is the maximum coverage I see of all the sequences I've mapped out. This shows the maximum surface area still covered today. So this is after all the erosion, after the flood and everything else, we still see this much coverage. And you might say, but Tim, it doesn't cover everything. So how do you know it flooded everything? Well, there is the bathtub ring in places, as we'll see up in Canada. If you zoom in North America particularly, we'll see there's a couple of dots up here, blue dots that they found by drilling in Hudson Bay and places in the Michigan Basin and Illinois Basin. There's evidence that these sediments were across this area. They can't just show up. They had to come in from the sides. You can't just drop a drone worth of sediment out there and say, oh, it's still there. Those had to come in from the outside. So even many of the conventional geologists will admit to, well, there had to be some way to get these sediments out here because they recognize they're out there as well. So I believe that's what I call the bathtub ring. So if you get out of your bathtub and you were really, really dirty like I used to be as a kid on the farm, you leave a dirty bathtub ring. You can see where the water was, and you can see where the water was. But you still might be scoffing, but going, well, I don't know about that. But here's what the Bible tells us. Day 150, this is what the world looked like. So why didn't it leave more sediment in Canada, for example? Or I could speak Canadian and say, why didn't it leave more sediment in Canada, eh? So being from Michigan, I have to speak Canadian once in a while. We have Tim Hortons, which apparently you guys are going to get down here soon. that went 15 cubits over the highest hills, the Bible tells us, which is about 23 feet. So that's all the higher the water went. But those waves were zipping across that 60 miles an hour, probably still 23 feet of water was still zipping across, ripped it right down to the crust. So whatever was at those high elevations was stripped right off. God says he wiped them off the earth. That's probably where the humans were at. Humans and a lot of the mammals, the horses and camels, things we find on top of the dinosaurs were stripped off from the highest hills and spread all over the earth. Many of them went into the oceans. But it didn't leave a lot behind. When you have 23 feet of water, you can't leave a lot of sediment behind. So that's why we don't find a lot of sediment on what was the highest hills. But we see crystalline rocks in Canada, Brazil, sub-Saharan Africa, all these locations around the world. So it's not a surprise when you read the Bible and you look at how much sediment's in Canada, for example, you don't see a lot of sediment because there wasn't a lot of water to leave a lot of sediment. So if you have 23 feet of water, you can only put in about 5 or 10 feet of sediment, maybe at the most. And then there was an ice age after the flood, and that's another story. But the ice age was a necessary ending to allow animals to get back in lower sea levels. But that ice age also destroyed a lot of these highest elevation sediments in the northern regions of the world. But in the Absarica and Zuni, we see a mixing of land and marine. There's a line right here where everything below this is pretty much all marine, those first three sequences. And all of a sudden we get land and marine, land and marine, land and marine. And this is the stuff that was stripped off, well, not the ice age per se, but a lot of these animals above the dinosaurs were the ones that are on the highest hills, and they were stripped off the top. So as you went along, you buried different ecological zones. That's what gives us the fossil record. It's not common descent from a single ancestor, which is utter nonsense, as you just saw. Show me an experiment where you can make life. They've been trying for how many years now? And they can't. And so you can't make inorganic rocks and minerals turn into organic compounds. It's not that easy. So it's the order of burial gives us the order, but it's always mixed with marine throughout. That's very, very important because it fits the flood. It matches perfectly with what the Bible tells us. And God did say the water went down so we can live on the land now. And he says in the wind, God made a wind to pass over the earth and the waters assuaged. It means they went back and forth, kind of like what tsunami waves do. You don't just get one tsunami wave, you get a multitude of them. So each sequence was basically a huge package of tsunami waves that came in and kind of backed off a little, and the next ones came in and backed off. Each time they got higher and higher and higher and peaked at about the end of the Cretaceous, end of the Zuni. And then this happened. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped. So the plates stopped moving so dramatically, the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters returned from off the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters were abated. So again, God repeats 150 days of rising water. So if you were a human on the earth, you might not have died till day 148, 149, maybe even 150. It must have been horrific. That last month must have just been awful because it just kept coming higher and higher and higher. And you're trying to huddle around on the last little bit of land. There's a lot of regret. A lot of regret. But their fate was sealed. And today, you have the opportunity to ask Jesus into your heart, if you haven't, so that you won't have the regret for eternity. You'll be cast into hell, eternal torment, forever and ever and ever, if you don't accept Jesus. But he's offered that free door, that opportunity. So here's the water going down. You see a lot of it shifts offshore. You see these really green colors are really thick areas, like in the Gulf of Mexico where we look for a lot of oil down there. And even the oil itself is from marine algae buried in the flood. That becomes our source rock. So God provided coal through the burial of plants. He provided oil through the burial of marine algae all over the world in different layers for us to use today. He knew we would need these energy resources today. And sure enough, there they are. We're using them to make our lives better. So here's the Tejas, again, mixing of land and marine, like we talked about before. So here, in conclusion to this section anyway, I got a little more to go. You guys don't need lunch anyway. Right? You're getting full of the Spirit. Does a pastor say as they go on? No. Well, I'm not a pastor, so we'll end on it. We'll end on time. All right, some pastors do. Conclusion, the global flood. Here's North America. Here you see the sequence. Here's these flood sequence. South America, see the same thing. Africa, peaks in the Zuni. Well, I think that's the global coverage is the best. Europe peaks a little bit earlier because Europe, I think, was more of a swampy area. Didn't have as much uplands. And so it flooded a little bit earlier. It's kind of small. So you add them all together, you get this pattern, which is why I drew my sea level curve to show, minimal flooding, minimal flooding, minimal flooding, and then it peaks. This we start to get the animals in the purple. Land animals show up in purple, and coal seams show up in purple, and then you get more land animals and coal, and more land animals and coal, even offshore. And it's not a surprise you have so much volume in at the end, because that's just Asia. If we add them all up, we get this. This is the world's total, which looks very similar to Asia, except we see 36% of all the rocks deposited during the flood are all the receding phase. And they shouldn't be a surprise because so many mountains pop up at this same time. The Rockies, the Andes, 80% of the world's mountains, the Himalayas, all of them pop up at the same time at the end of the flood when the water's receding. And that has to do with plate tectonics as well, and the thicker crust pushes rocks up higher and mountains up higher, and things we don't need to get into. But that was causing a lot of erosion. Not only was it stripping off the land, but it was eroding off these mountains that were popping up like the Black Hills. You can see the core of these mountains because all the tops were stripped off them. And a lot of them was transported into the oceans as well. So here's kind of my summary chart of the flood. You can see day 1 down there starts in the Sauk, and day 40 where the arc starts to float, and then day 150, and we kind of, I'm not 100% certain, but it kind of works this way. The rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and that's those first 3 sequences where it's all marine fossils mostly. Now we know the arc is floating, so we know we're flooding land. At this point, day 40, and you're working where the water's prevailed increasingly. That's days 40 to day 150. Water's prevailed exceedingly, the whole mountain's recovered, day 150. And again, most of the mountains hadn't formed, mountains we think of as mountains, until after this, until this receding phase. They return off the earth continually. So here's kind of our summary. You stack these sequences on top of each other, boom, boom, boom. You see there's very little flooding early, and then all of a sudden there's a lot more, because now you're flooding the land, and even more. And you get the receding phase. And this is what you see. This is the world's rocks all the way up. And you see there's still areas that kind of that blue, same color as this. There are no rocks today because these areas were the highest hills, and they only had 23 feet of water zipping across them. It didn't leave a lot of sediments behind. But you can see that again. It's pretty amazing. So there was a global flood. There's evidence out there. It's undeniable evidence of a global flood. It was also catastrophic. We see bones and fossils. We see mixing animals eating each other. We see land plants mixed with, fishy, swimming animals. We see dinosaurs and fish. We see fish eating fish, the last meals, eating fish. They're not gagging and choking on these like some evolutionists have suggested. They really have. These things were buried instantly to preserve them. You only make a fossil by burying things rapid and deep. Fossils aren't forming today hardly anywhere, except for major landslides possibly. But those are going to be just little tiny little specks. The global fossil record comes from the global flood. And we see flat and stacked coal beds like this. There's no evidence that this was a swamp because we don't see any roots anywhere. There's no trees, roots in the bottom down here. If this was a swamp that built up over millions of years, and then there's another swamp, and many of these rocks around it are limestone, which are marine rocks. So obviously you're mixing marine and land, even in the rock layers. But they're perfectly flat. Everywhere we look at coal seams, perfect flat tops and bottoms. Just piles of vegetation buried and squished in the flood. And there's few erosional surfaces. This is the Coconino sandstone in Grand Canyon on top of a very soft hermit shale. It's supposed to be about 1 million years of erosion there, and look at this line. Everywhere you look in Grand Canyon, it's the same. Where are the canyons? Where are the rifts and gullies and valleys that should have been carved in 1 million years' time on this surface? If you're an old earther, where are they? And it gets even worse. Here in Grand Canyon is Redwall Limestone, big, huge, thick limestone. Here's the Muov Limestone. There's supposed to be 160 million years on this line right here. I'll go back. Do you see how flat everything is? Flat on flat. 160 million years of time, there was no uplift, no folding, no nothing. That's what we see all over the world, all over the country, in fact. Extensive stacked layers are everywhere. We can see them better in Grand Canyon. But as you drill these wells in these columns I look at, you see that everywhere. They go all the way from here to Michigan. Here's the Redwall Limestone in blue down here in Grand Canyon. Well, it's the same limestone all the way up the Rockies, all the way over to my home state of Michigan, all the way down here in Texas. You can drill a well here, hit the same limestone that you can see in Grand Canyon right here in Texas. That blue is across the whole country. We can go back and see where all these caves are. But here's the same sandstone, the Tapete sandstone, the bottom layers in Grand Canyon in yellow. goes across the entire country. So it starts here in Grand Canyon. You see it everywhere, all the way to Michigan, my home state, all the way up the Rockies, down here in Texas. You can drill a well, and they have. That's why we know it goes this far. So it isn't just what you can see in Grand Canyon. These layers go across the entire United States. What could deposit these layers that oftentimes are only as thick as this room? What could deposit these in one big swath other than a global flood? What's the best explanation? It's not slowly millions of years of rivers moving their way across, because you wouldn't get the same exact sandstone everywhere you look. You wouldn't get the same limestone everywhere you look. You see stacked layers even in Grand Canyon. There's no evidence of all this millions of years over here. You can use the same names, but the millions of years are just fabricated. But they need the millions of years because they need the millions of years to have evolution. If you don't have millions of years, you have no evolution. The rocks confirm layer upon layer upon layer. No evidence of time in between. There's no evidence of millions of years missing between these sequences. So the third thing is a recent flood. We're going to finish on this. I'm going to have to talk even faster because we got a lot to go. So it's going to go quick. But what about those radiometric dates people often wonder about? I stole this from my colleague, Dr. Jake Hebert. I think that's him. That's a picture of him over there. But he's going to become a cartoon on our next planetarium show. Don't they prove the Earth is old? That's what people argue today. But these are facts. They teach them as facts when I went to geology classes. They teach them as facts when you watch movies. When you go to the Jurassic Park and Jurassic World movies, they indoctrinate you with millions and millions of years. But let's test the rocks where we know how old the rocks are. And this is just some of them. We could go on and on and on on these, but I don't have time. Let's look at some rocks of known ages. And what Steve Austin did when he worked for ICR is he went over to Mount St. Helens 10 years after it erupted, and he sampled some of the new lava dome and sent it to some labs. And they got estimates between 340,000 years old to 2.8 million years old for a rock that we saw form and crystallize and cool 10 years ago. So how accurate is that? This will be in a book. That's how old those rocks are. But we know it's 10 years old. Here's a few more examples. These are published in regular conventional geology journals. This isn't ICR. This is other people that did these. Old dates for rocks is the norm. So here's a bunch of basalts in Hawaii, Italy, Sicily, all these different places, all over the place. And you know the age of these lavas and rocks, and yet here's what they measured when they sampled them all. When they sent them off to the labs to age date these. This is the numbers. Do you see anything close to the right answer? Here's more, because you guys want more. Look at this. We know how old these are, and yet here's the numbers we get. So if you keep building a bridge as an engineer, and the bridge keeps collapsing, keep building a bridge, keeps collapsing, and the engineer says, oh, it's fine, drive over it. I know it's right. Would you? If these keep collapsing, well, they know the date of these, and then they test them, and they're not even close. They're many orders of magnitude off, as the mathematicians would tell you. A lot of zeros off. They're not even close. Almost every time that they've tested them, known age rocks, they get the wrong answer. Way, way wrong answers. Yet they're telling you these are factual. We did this, and ICR did this. We tested their Cardenas basalt down here. You can see this in our Grand Canyon exhibit. And then we tested this lava that came over the top. We know this is younger because the canyon was already there when that lava poured over the side. Lava falls, they call them. So this had to be buried earlier because you have all these rocks stacked on top. And then this erupted later, all during the flood probably. But here's what we did. This was 1.07 billion years. This is 1.34 billion years. How can this rock, which is an ice age, be older than the rock down here? I mean, it makes no sense. That's the kind of numbers you get. I mean, you send samples off, and they would just say, oh, this was bad sampling, or this was contaminated sample, or this whatever. If you don't get the number you want, they just explain it away until they get the right number they want, and they're like, okay, that's it. But then how do they verify that? There's no way to verify it besides another technique, which also gives you a different number usually. And so if isotope methods give incorrect age estimates of known rocks, why are we supposed to trust them at all? But yet they're taught to our kids, our grandkids, me, you, as fact. They're in all the movies as fact. And they can't go back and verify any of them. And the problem is this, too many assumptions. In essence, we have a two-dimensional understanding of a four-dimensional problem. And for you mathematicians in here, it's like two equations with four unknowns. If you're a math person, you know you have to have two equations and two unknowns. Four unknowns, you got to have four equations. For every one you don't know, you got to have an equation. Well, they only have 2 equations, so what do? They make up 2 of the answers. They assume things they can't assume, and then of course, and then it looks really good because there are 2 equations they use. They're like, oh, this is very scientific. But they have to assume the first 2. And so that's the problem why every time they test, almost every time they test a rock of known age, they get numbers way off. They're way off the mark. This might be a precise technique, but it's nowhere near accurate. I can shoot at a target all day long, and I'll be shooting off to the left. Get a really good cluster, but I'm not accurate. I might be precise because I'm hitting the same spot, but I'm not hitting the target. That's why Dr. G won't let me go shooting with him. Because he's accurate and precise, whereas I'm just precisely inaccurate is what I am. And that's what these rocks are. Anyway, and then Dr. Bryan talks about this a lot as well. Science is confirming at a young age. We go to the rocks again. The rocks buried in the flood. We find soft things like that, stretches like a rubber band. These are collagen, the soft tissue. The fossils are revealing proteins and blood vessels and blood cells and osteocytes, which are the bone-making cells, all the things that can't last more than thousands of years. Here's the example of a blood vessel. It's supposed to be 195 million years old. Here's osteocytes, the bone-making cells, and the little villi coming off the side. And these little black dots are red blood cells, presumably. But you can see all this in the bones today. This is from way back in 2017. But they find they prove they have blood vessels. Here's a T-Rex blood vessel with probably a T-Rex red blood cell in it. There's over 122 now, or at least 122 published scientific papers in the conventional journals. Over and over and over, they're finding more every year. So the bottom line is, there was a flood. It was catastrophic. It buried all these fossils. And the rocks we see, not only we can go back to those plates that are deep in the earth that are still cold. That's clue number 1, that the flood was recent. Because they're still cold all the way down to the mantle, all the way in through the mantle into the core. Secondly, we have all these blood vessels and cells and proteins. They can't survive millions of years. Yet we're finding them over and over and over 122 now. And even oil. Oil is organic as well. Oil can't last millions of years. The oil companies told me we're drilling oil. It's 150 million years old in Wyoming. It's just sitting there waiting for us to drill. But you know darn well, you put gasoline out in your shed and leave it out there 20 years and try to put it in your lawnmower, how's it going to run? Not very well. Well, there's bacteria underground too. So most oil we do produce is heavily biodegraded, or at least partially biodegraded. And some of it's probably still forming today. Oil is not old either. Oil is another example of a creation moment when you can be putting in your car today, you can grumble about the price. That's all politics, because there's a lot of oil. The reason I'm at ICR ultimately is because we were too good at our job as geologists, found too much oil prices crash. Then they lay us off. That's why I got a Ph.D. I never would have got one. And then ICR wouldn't hire me without a Ph.D., so here I am. And so ultimately God had a plan. That was a quick summary of my career. But now I'm actually doing what God had trained me to do as an oil and gas geologist. He said, you did enough of that. Got my Ph.D., you did enough of that. Now I need you at ICR. So this is the greatest job I could ever have. I'm finally doing what God has called me to do. I finally figured out at age 52, 10 years ago, what God had planned for me. So some of you might not know what God's plan is, but He has one. He's preparing you. Just like He prepared Moses. Moses was 80. I wasn't 80 anyway. But God has a plan. You just have to turn your life over to Him. So here's the bottom line right here, the collapse of deep time in evolution. You pull away the deep time, and evolution collapses as well. That's why we're having a geology talk here, and not just biology. Because if we pull away this crazy concept of millions and billions of years, which has no basis. It has no basis in the rocks. The rocks could be deposited very, very quickly in the flood year that the Bible describes. If you pull that away, you have no chance of evolution even happening. Darwin needed this. As he said, it's a whole mindset. You start thinking deep time, you can do anything. But even with all the time they have in the world, it's still, we keep looking and looking, it's still impossible. That's why they can't create life in the laboratory. Only God can create life.